I'm going to begin with what has, at least for the last 15 minutes, become the most famous artwork in America. This is, of course, Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary, which, as I'm sure you're probably aware, is a painting that caused all the brouhaha at the British Museum's Sensation show. The way that it was described endlessly in the media was a Madonna alternately smeared with or spattered with elephant dung. But of course, as you can see looking at this, far from that. In fact, there is some elephant dung in the image. This sort of round ball here is this sort of breast-like image. And there's also, not visible in this slide, two other little balls of dung on which the painting rests. What seems to have created so much of the problem for the viewers of this is, I think, this notion that the Madonna, this sort of sacrosanct image of the Madonna, has been defiled by the close association with a kind of excrement, with a substance which we in our culture tend to associate with dirt, with vileness, with all that we find most horrible. And in fact, however, one of the things that many of the supporters of this painting tried to point out over and over again, and to very little avail to the Christian right, was that Chris O'Feely comes from a Nigerian background, and that this painting is part of a series of works in which he is exploring his heritage, and that after spending time in Africa, he began to use elephant dung as a recurring symbol in his work. One of the things that elephant dung symbolizes in African cultures is fertility. And of course, what's more appropriate to an image of the Virgin Mary than elephant dung, a symbol of fertility? Curiously, in the reception to this work, it was the dung that was focused on, even though what might have thought was a more objectionable element. You see these little forms floating around, which seem to serve the function of little putti that you would find in a Renaissance painting, are in fact little cutouts from pornographic magazines. But curiously, it was the dung that caused the problem. This controversy, of course, was extremely reminiscent of another one 10 years ago, the whole brouhaha over Andre Serrano's Piss Christ. In this case, there was again a little label which disseminated throughout the press, and for many people began to encapsulate this work of art, particularly those who had not ever seen it. The little kind of catchphrase was, "The crucifix dipped in urine." If we actually look at the actual work of art, something quite different seems to emerge. It's a dime store crucifix, yes, and it's been shot through this sort of film of urine, although we wouldn't necessarily know that if we didn't know the title of the piece. But the effect of it is to create this kind of almost supernatural radiance. And in fact, like the Chris O'Feely piece, it's a very beautiful image. And anyone sort of looking unprejudicially at this image might find it hard to imagine how this or the Holy Virgin Mary were in fact these horrible anti-Catholic images which they were charged with being. Images like this have been attacked as anti-Catholic and have been attacked as blasphemous, sacrilegious, demeaning to all those who have any kind of faith. The response to these images and others that I'll be showing, in fact, is about a kind of antipathy towards Catholicism. Not Orthodox Catholicism, but Catholicism as a worldview, as a way of thinking about and organizing reality. In almost every case, the artists in recent years who've been charged with blasphemy and sacrilege have come from Catholic backgrounds. For example, Robert Mapplethorpe, Robert Gober, Karen Finlay, David Wojnarowicz, and if we want to go outside the art sphere, we can talk about the playwright Terrence McNally, or even the filmmaker Martin Scorsese. Artists from Catholic backgrounds tend to explore the links between sexuality and spirituality in ways that begin to seem transgressive to the larger culture. And the question then that this raises for me, and this is the question that I'll be addressing in this lecture tonight, is this: is there something inherent in Catholic doctrine or in Catholic teaching which encourages artists to explore religious taboos and the extremes of sexuality? And I'm going to be answering that in the affirmative. America's religious conflicts tend to play themselves out in art. And America, we must remember, is from its founding days, a country whose dominant religion is Protestantism, and a Protestantism that comes out of our English Puritan heritage. And so when you hear conservative politicians talk about the fact that this is a Christian country, they're not talking about the fact that it's a Catholic country. They're talking about the fact that it is a Christian country, and Christian for them meaning a certain kind of body of doctrine which takes as one of its central tenets the notion that the body is the enemy of the soul, that there is this strict separation between these two realms of experience. And as a result of that, the body is sort of the source of our temptation. It's the thing that leads us astray. And in order then to be saved, to gain salvation, we must sever ourselves from those desires of the body. And what this does, of course, this kind of a doctrine, is to lead to a distrust of sensual knowledge and of physical experience. And because of that, then, a tendency to dismiss art as a means of approaching God. And that's why, if you think about sort of the classic, English congregational church, the sort favored by many of our founding fathers, it's a beautiful white church, completely devoid of images, light streaming in, a kind of metaphor for purity and for that other non-bodily, non-carnal realm. Now, contrast that with the tradition of the Spanish Mission Church, or even the Catholic Baroque Church, full of images, crawling with images, completely full of sensual experience. And I think that gives us a sense of the difference between these two worldviews. And to the extent that I think we could say that, in a sense, this kind of Puritan-based American Protestantism is a culture of the Word. And opposed to that is this American Catholic tradition, which is the culture of the image. And I think that it becomes clearer if we think about the ways in which, both visually and theologically, Catholicism puts great emphasis on the physical realm. All of the great mysteries of Catholicism stress the physical body, from the Immaculate Conception, which is the notion that the Virgin Mary was conceived without sin so that she could thus become a vessel for the transmission of God, of Jesus, to human form. The Incarnation, which of course is that transformation of God, the Son of God, into human form. The Crucifixion, in which the salvation of the world is affected by the death of the physical body of that mediator. The resurrection, of course, the bringing of that body back to physical life. And finally, and in a sense, maybe most significantly, transubstantiation, which is this is what happens in the Mass, in the central ritual of Catholicism, in which, in the course of the Mass, the wine and the host, the piece of bread, which kind of relate back to the original First Supper, which of course is a replay of a Jewish Passover, that the wine and the host are actually transformed, according to Catholicism, in the course of the Mass to the body and blood of Christ, and then are shared with the faithful. And so obviously the body is absolutely key in this whole process. And that's because, unlike this Protestant view in which the body and the soul are seen as really belonging to these separate realms, of not really interacting, that one in fact being a drag on the other, in Catholicism there's a much more ambiguous view. On the one hand, yes, it's true that it is through the pleasures of the body and the desires of the body that we are led into sin, and that can lead us, to our spiritual destruction. But on the other hand, the body is absolutely key to the whole drama of our salvation, because without Christ becoming human, without Mary actually bearing him as a child, without him actually dying on the cross and being resurrected, basically we don't get saved. And so the body then has this sort of dual role. It's the realm of the flesh, it's the realm of sin, but it's also this absolutely crucial link between ourselves and the divine realm. And as a result, in Catholicism, we tend to see much more of a sense of a continuity between the body and the soul, the human and the divine realms. We tend to see that the sensuality of art is often used to convey religious truths. That's why we have this magnificent tradition of Catholic art. Traditionally, in this kind of Catholic art, the artists dwelled on the erotic side of Christian imagery. And of course, the classic case of this is Bernini's St. Teresa in Ecstasy, which we see here. And of course, what's going on here is this is an image of Saint Teresa. It's based on one of her mystical visions in which she gained this union with Christ and fell back in a swoon and felt an angel piercing her heart many times. But what Bernini's done with this, of course, is to give us an image of a woman who looks suspiciously like someone in the throes of physical orgasm. And that's because within Catholicism, this sense of the continuity between the divine and the physical realm, there was this understanding by artists that the way in which the only way we really have, the only means we have to convey these spiritual truths is through the imagery and the experiences that we have here in the world. And so this notion, this kind of eroticism, this kind of conflation of spiritual and physical ecstasy is a thing that comes in again and again. That's, I think, a very important element, and we're going to see that coming back again, this notion that there's a kind of slippage between the spiritual and the physical realms of desire and ecstasy. Another theme that I think will be coming back again and again is this notion of the mortification of the body. And again, this goes back to the cult of the saints, who are, in a sense, replaying the life of Christ and his own willingness to undergo mutilation and finally death for the sake of mankind. And so we have this whole cult of the martyrs, who died in all kinds of grisly ways, and then were very graphically depicted doing so in a whole host of paintings. It was a very popular subject. This, of course, is Saint Sebastian. And he's an absolutely gorgeous physical specimen. Again, the eroticism is unmistakably there. And here he is sort of twisting to all of these arrows piercing his body. And I think when you look at an image like this is Mantegna's Saint Sebastian, it becomes clear why Saint Sebastian's become kind of a poster boy these days for sadomasochistic bondage. And again, it's a theme that's going to come up again, so keep this image in mind. Now, what about female sexuality? This is Donatello's Mary Magdalene, and it's a kind of really one of the more remarkable images, I think, in the whole Renaissance lexicon. We all know Mary Magdalene as the kind of fallen prostitute who redeems herself and rejects her ways, and through the love of Christ, and it probably is in love with Christ also, but through the love of Christ, redeems her ways and becomes a saint. What's interesting is that generally in Catholic imagery, she's depicted as a very voluptuous, very sexual, kind of in her kind of pre-redeemed mode. But Donatello has chosen instead to depict her in her latter days as a woman of a hermit who has escaped to the desert to repent her sins. And here she's in animal skins, and there's a very animal-like quality. And this is a kind of a theme that we'll be tracing as well, is this notion of female sexuality and a kind of ambiguous and ambivalent sense about female sexuality, and the sense that it on the one hand, you have the Virgin Mary or a saint like Saint Teresa, sort of beautiful, virginal, and pure. On the other side, you've got this kind of wild animal female side, and there's a kind of tension between the two, which I think has become very productive for contemporary artists. This is Signorelli's Last Judgment. The damned souls are kind of writhing in agony here and sort of being brought down to hell, and then you have sort of these demons here. You see figures falling from the sky, demons carrying them off. Again, here there's a whole sense that sort of in these writhing bodies and the very physicality of this image of a kind of marriage of the eroticism of death and sin. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that in Catholicism, the physicality and the eroticism of the human body become tools by which to teach spiritual truths. We as modern people looking at these images tend to read that eroticism kind of more directly. These kinds of images, which are images that when one grows up Catholic, one is inundated with, have a very kind of important effect on one's psyche. And what I'm going to argue here is that contemporary artists who come from Catholic backgrounds really reveal very much the influences of this kind of imagery, and also of the Catholic Church's emphasis generally on this kind of ambiguous and ambivalent relationship between the physical and the spiritual realms. And I want to just make one caveat here, that the artists that I'm going to be talking about are not necessarily Orthodox believers. And in fact, probably the only one who really is Chris O'Feely, who I showed at the outset. The rest of them are what we call in the trade lapsed Catholics. But as anyone who was raised as a Catholic knows, you're never ex, you're only lapsed. It's always still there. Some of their work is, in fact, very transgressive. It takes these kinds of images, these kinds of ideas, and pushes it in certain ways. But if you think back in terms of these kinds of images that I'm showing you here, it's clear that in some ways what they're doing is really only an exaggeration of Orthodox Catholic beliefs and Orthodox Catholic imagery. Now, I want to begin with Robert Mapplethorpe because, of course, here's another highly controversial figure. And I'm beginning with a piece of his called Dennis Spate with Calla Lily, because this image, I think, is particularly striking in the debt that it owes to conventional religious imagery. Here you can see any number of saints, or even images actually of the risen Christ holding a lily that this image seems to mimic. There's a whole other subtext going on here. We have this kind of very muscular, very attractive, very homoerotic male figure kind of staring provocatively at us. And what's going on here is, I think, that has to do with Mapplethorpe's very particular relationship to his Catholicism. He was raised as a Catholic, and in fact, once he told an interviewer that the two most important influences on his art were Coney Island and the Catholic Church. And he was also asked once what was sacred to him, and he told the interviewer that sex was sacred to him. He uses the language of spiritual imagery, of religious ecstasy, of spiritual desire. But he uses them, this language that's been developed throughout the tradition of Catholicism. He uses it to express sexual experience and sexual desire. And so he makes a lot of formal borrowings from religious art. And I think that also that his whole kind of focus on perfection, the perfection of the body, is very much a reflection also of this kind of notion that the way in which, in traditional Catholic art, think back to Saint Sebastian, that the perfection of the soul is reflected in the perfection of the body. So again, he's sort of taking this over. But for him, this notion of having, as a gay man, come into great conflict with his Catholic upbringing, he's taken the language, he's taken in a sense the spirituality, and he's turned it around to his own end. So in this particular case, turning around to deal with it in terms of the language of sexuality. And if you think about his work in this way, it sort of puts a whole different cast on it. So for example, there are numerous images of bondage. And one of the things, okay, first of all, I want you to note the way in which it's lit, the way in which it's placed, that there's this kind of light coming down that, it's sort of like the divine light, again, that you tend to see in these religious paintings. And in fact, he did a number of works which were triptychs, clearly kind of based on the notion of the altarpiece. Now, the central image that we see here, of course, is a figure who's completely in this sort of bondage outfit. This is someone who is completely at the control of another person. It's an image of total submission. And of course, from a Catholic point of view, then this notion of total submission of the soul to Christ, which is what the martyrs, after all, were all about, that to allow your body to be totally, mutilated and flagellated and destroyed because of your loyalty to Christ. It's a kind of distorted reflection, essentially, of that same kind of idea. And I think it's sort of particularly clear in an image like this here, where we actually have what reads to me as a kind of inverted crucifix. And it brings to mind the stories about St. Peter, who asked to be, when he was being martyred, asked to be martyred upside down because he felt that he wasn't good enough to be martyred right side up like Jesus. There's something in this image. I mean, it's disturbing on one hand, but on the other hand, you can see this, that the echoes again of this kind of Catholic sort of imagery. Mapplethorpe also did a number of self-portraits. In a lot of them, he's kind of making himself sort of like a Lucifer figure. And it's important, I think, to remember that in the whole kind of theology of Christianity, that Lucifer was God's fallen favorite. He was the most beautiful of the angels, who then fell away and became the leader of the prince of darkness, of the dark forces. And I think that one of the things that's going on here is that Mapplethorpe, feeling in a sense closed out from this religion that was very profound and important to him in his childhood, takes on or identifies with this role of the fallen favorite in an image like this, or even more so here, and this is an image sort of later in his life, this sort of death's head. There's something kind of very dark here about identifying again with the sort of the forces of death, the forces of evil. And of course this is a self-portrait that was done when he was near death. He knew that he was going to be dying of AIDS, and I find it incredibly somber and powerful, and I think pairs interestingly with this image, which is one of his last works, this image of a skull. This, of course, clearly relates to the whole tradition of the memento mori, the skull, the reminder of the vanity of earthly things. And like the image before, kind of the once beautiful figure that sort of, with time, is lost to the forces of decay and corruption. And again, this kind of notion of the corruption of the flesh is very, very Catholic in my view. One of the things about Mapplethorpe that strikes me, as I was saying, this sort of notion that sex is sacred being key to his work, is that what happens in his work, that he's taking pure carnality, pure physicality, pure sexuality, and in a sense almost raising it to the level of religious experience. And his work brings to mind to me a very interesting essay by Susan Sontag on the pornographic imagination, in which she talks about the fact that in a secular age like our own, there are very few avenues towards transcendence of oneself and of the world around one, and that if spirituality isn't available, sort of the only thing that's left really are the extremes of sexual experience. I want to turn now to Andre Serrano. Now again, it's important to be aware of his background. He has a mixed Hispanic background. He was raised as a Catholic, went to catechism classes when he was young, no longer practicing, but his religion remains incredibly important to him, to the extent that he lives actually in an apartment which is totally surrounded by ecclesiastical furniture and religious art. I mean, it's like a stage set. It's absolutely incredible to go in there, and you go in there and you realize, how totally a part of him this kind of Catholic imagery and sort of the whole trappings of Catholicism are. Now, what's going on with Serrano, I think, is something different than what's happening with Mapplethorpe, because in a lot of ways he's much less conflicted about his Catholicism. Now this is an early work, and in his early work there was in fact a certain anger at the orthodoxies of the Catholic Church, and this is a piece which he did, which was really meant to address the whole question of the treatment of women, particularly in Latin American countries. So you have this woman sort of drenched in blood, and then this cardinal looking very sort of smug and self-satisfied. And what I think, this was early work, and he sort of quickly moved from this to work which was not so overtly confrontative, and which actually was much more involved with this notion of beauty. Essentially, I think that he sees beauty as a means of connection with the divine realm. And one can read his work as a continuing tendency to transform sort of the baseness of matter into something that's beautiful, transcendent, and absolutely, kind of has a spiritual content. And it's very much about this kind of notion of transubstantiation, of the notion of starting from the low, the despised and the material world, and turning it into something else. And that's obviously a very Catholic theme. And we can see that in an early series of works, his Fluid series. And one of the things that the critics of Piss Christ, I think, missed out was that they didn't put that into the larger context of his work, because that was only one of a whole series of works he was doing at the time in which he was working with body fluids. This one is called Milk Cross, and that sort of explains what it is. This cross form in the middle is milk, and surrounding it is cow's blood. One of the things that's going on here is, and this is a theme that's going to be coming up again and again in this work, is this notion of bodily fluids. This is a very Catholic thing. The carnality, the physicality of Catholicism, the importance of the body, means also that there's this very great importance attached to bodily fluids. And so you have this emphasis on the blood of Christ or the blood of the martyrs. There's all these stories of martyrs whose blood boils at the day of their that they were killed, or that the day their saint's day. There's an emphasis, of course, on mother's milk. Again, endless portrayals of the Virgin Mary suckling the baby Jesus. Those are the two kind of main fluids, but there are other fluids that come into play as well, not so much in the imagery, but in Catholic theology and doctrine. There's a whole thing about semen, and it's as a means of sort of transmission of the divine spark of humanity, into a new being. And there's great emphasis on fluids. Fluids become this kind of connecting thing between the divine and the human realm. And I think that one of the reasons actually that Catholic artists get into trouble all the time is because in our culture, and again going back to the notion that our culture is very shaped by this original kind of English Protestant mode, and it seems to affect all of us, even if we weren't actually raised in that religion, is in our country a kind of squeamishness about bodily fluids. So when artists from Catholic backgrounds play with this notion of bodily fluids, often again it tends to be construed as an attack or as something negative, when in fact that is not at all what it's coming out of. A series that came subsequently after the fluids was this one, the Klan series. And in this case, he actually got to know, sort of infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan and got sufficient confidence from them that the Grand Wizards, or whatever they're called, allowed him to take their portraits, of course, wearing the hoods. The way that he's photographed it unmistakably looks like Catholic religious art. I mean, you think about sort of medieval robes, medieval priesthood, monks, and of course that's part of their symbolism as well. But the other thing that's going on here, and to me in a sense this is probably his most problematic body of work, but he again is this notion of taking that which is despised, that which is base, and transforming it. And certainly that's happened here. I mean, there's probably no group more despised throughout American culture generally than the Ku Klux Klan, and yet here, it's being invested with this other kinds of sensibility. Now, less problematically, he operated simultaneously to doing this body of work. He performed the same operation on another group of people who tend to be despised or ignored in our culture, and that's the homeless. There's a series here called The Nomads, in which he took these portraits of homeless people, but taking them in such a way that actually they're heroic. In this particular case, he was also thinking about the Edward Curtis photographs of the vanishing Indians. That was a conscious model. But I think that from our Catholic point of view, what's significant again is this notion of transfiguration, transformation of something from one state, this kind of low material state, to this kind of much more spiritual and divine and beautiful state. For him, this notion of beauty really has to do with this notion of the beauty as a kind of link to our transformation, a link to the divine realm. I think that the body of work, though, that does this for me the most purely, and that I see this sensibility of his, in its kind of most pristine form, is a series of works called the Morgue series. And these are works he did in a morgue. He took photographs of bodies. They were bodies that had come into the morgue. They were unclaimed, and they all kind of died in various horrific ways. But the photographs have transformed these kind of abandoned figures, these people who in life apparently nobody cared enough about to claim them in death. And he transforms them again into remarkably beautiful images, and images again which have a very conscious relationship to traditional Catholic art. And another thing that's going on here that's interesting is that there's a textual element. The titles add something, they add a dimension. The title is simply the name of how this person died. This one is called Fatal Meningitis, and yet the image doesn't convey that. The image it's clearly a kind of Christ child sort of figure. I mean, it's really absolutely beautiful, and it brings to mind the Catholic notion of the numinous, which is the idea that the spirit still inheres in the physical flesh, the physical body, even after that body has died. Another example, This one is called AIDS-related death. But again, the crossed hands make us think of any number of paintings of kind of the Virgin Mary or Christ or someone, with their, particularly the Virgin Mary, I think, with her hands over her breast. I mean, it's again a very beautiful and lyrical image. Or finally this one, which is called Rat Poison Suicide. But again, I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, the way that it's lit, it's like sort of a Caravagesque kind of lighting. I mean, it's dramatic, and it's completely transformed into something else. So, as I was saying, for me, these are probably the most profoundly spiritual of the works that Serrano has done, and the ones that most clearly to me show the ways in which his sort of Catholic heritage has worked its way through into his art. I want to turn now to another artist, raised Catholic, and this is Robert Gober. His work has been, for a long time, preoccupied with the body, and not just with the body, but with issues of purity and disease. A lot of, in a sense, a lot of his work is and his sense of the body is inflected through the AIDS crisis, probably in part because he's a gay man, but also because it's been such an important sort of element in our culture in recent years. So a lot of the work is about purity or disease. It's about cleansing. It's about death, and also about the absurdity of the body. It's very much about the sort of the dualities of Catholicism. Dualities, of course, are absolutely key to Catholicism, because you've got this whole, body, soul, divine, physical, these realms that get kind of mixed up together, and that's one of the things that's going on here. This is an image. It's kind of, it's both, it's humorous. There's a pathos to it, and also a beauty to it as well. It's kind of basically in the shape of a flour sack, but also it's clearly a female body, but then it's also covered with hair. So there's all these kind of mixed signals that are going on here. On the one hand, sort of the pure objectness of the flour sack, but then the physical, the reference to the body. Then there's this kind of male-female thing with the breasts and the hair. And then also kind of the flour sack itself, that notion of whiteness as that kind of, ever-present metaphor for purity, which then is identified with the spiritual realm. So even in a work like this, which has no kind of overt kind of religious content, I think that it's clear that you can see these kinds of things at work. 2 years ago, he did a chapel installation where he really brought these issues to the fore in an explicit way. And I think one of the things that's going on here is that you get to a certain age, and after having decided early on maybe that you've rejected your religious upbringing, it doesn't mean anything to you anymore, you've transcended all that, you get to a point in middle age and you suddenly begin to realize, and I can speak for myself as someone raised Catholic, that this is something that happened to me, and you begin to realize that maybe you don't want to become a practicing Catholic again, but that you have to accept the way that it has shaped you and shaped the way you think about the world in incredibly profound ways. And so he did this chapel installation, and it incidentally was another Catholic controversy, I think, again, because of the misreading, the inability to sort of read this piece with all of its complexities. You walked into the gallery, and it was kind of your typical white box gallery. And in the center, this is actually a life-size Madonna here with this pipe coming through her midsection. She's standing on a grate. On two sides are a couple of suitcases, and then behind her is this staircase. It's not accessible to you, but you hear water. You can see water coming down it. Now, as you approach the Virgin, you find that looking through this central cavity, you get this view directly of the staircase and the water falling down behind. Then you look down at the grate that she is standing on, and you see that there's a grotto underneath. And so from the starkness of this surrounding white box, all of a sudden you're in this kind of very rich, green, sensuous-looking realm. And of course the water is coming down into this grotto. And I don't have a good slide, I don't have a slide of this, but one of the things that you also glimpse as you look underneath is you see that the bottom portion of a man's legs holding a child's legs. What it's really about is a kind of meditation on the different realms, the realms of heaven and earth, the realms of death and life. The Virgin Mary, again, is this central kind of figure who causes the link between heaven and earth. This central pipe, and incidentally, this pipe was the thing that caused all the trouble. Again, the reduction to a little phrase. This was the Madonna pierced with the sewage pipe. What happens is that this pipe then is a kind of reference to this notion of Mary as this conduit, of a conduit of grace, conduit of sort of the divine life. And the fact that it's a pipe, a sewage pipe, again, this sort of notion of fluids comes back in again, this element that brings it, that links these different realms. So then reading that, you look down, you see the grotto, this is this other realm, this realm perhaps of heaven, or it's hard to say which is heaven and which is hell, and that's one of the things that's interesting about it. The stark white purity of the white box, that's maybe our conventional notion of heaven, this purity. But then on the other hand, this very organic image below, or is that the image of paradise, of the paradise that we're going to? So it's really kind of playing with and thinking about the complexities of these sort of the dual realms that appear in religion. The final element, these suitcases, and again, you can look down the suitcases into the grotto as well. But the suitcases themselves, of course, are obviously a symbol of passage, of travel. And so again, all of the elements then add up to this meditation on the notion of this sort of a journey in a way between heaven and earth. Of course, it wasn't read that way. Catholicism basically came to this country by way of the colonies, by the colonists, the Spanish or the French colonists. And particularly, I think that the influence of the Spanish on artists in the Southwest or in Mexico is very profound. This is the work of Julio Galán, who is a Mexican artist, and his work is very much involved with folk imagery, Mexican and sort of Southwest imagery, retablos, crucifixes, bleeding hearts, the Christ child, various kinds of devotional imagery. One of the things that actually I think is very interesting about the Spanish version of Catholicism, or this sort of Spanish influenced Catholicism, is that if you go out, say, to New Mexico, and I've spent some time there, you discover that kind of, I guess because of a fluke of history, that the Catholicism that came there, which came with the Spaniards, is essentially a late medieval version of Catholicism, and it kind of stuck. And so that's a version of Catholicism that tends to be very, very physical, very visceral. There's sort of, amazing images of kind of blood and agony, and it has this very strong physical character. And that's something that you find in a lot of the art. The crucifix here is it's flowing down buckets of blood. I mean, they're usually bloody, but this one goes, way farther than the usual. There's those body fluids coming back to haunt us again. In a lot of his work, there's the Catholic motif, and there's another motif going on as well, which is that he as again another gay artist. And it's interesting, in fact, that so many of the sort of more transgressive Catholic artists tend to be gay men or women, or they come sort of maybe from outside the mainstream. And I think that's another issue that can be discussed. So he's dealing also with kind of images of desire, sexual and physical desire, and once again this kind of notion of the blurring of these two realms. In his work generally, there's this little face that you see here recurs again and again, and it's really a kind of idealized self-portrait. And what's happening in this series of work I'm going to show now is a kind of identification, in a sense, with the Christ figure, which I think has a lot to do with this notion again of desire. That within Catholicism, there seems to be such a parallelism between physical and spiritual desire. So here, for example, we start with this one, in which we have this manger basically, and here a kind of sense of identification with the Christ child, a kind of wanting to return, in a sense, to this other state, surrounded by other kinds of images that are common in his work, this sort of egg-like globe shape. There's lots of eggs, there's lots of roses, there's lots of kind of blood kind of references. Again, all these kinds of organic, fertile, fluid, body fluid things come up again and again in his work. So then an older child here here standing on a ladder before this monumental Christ, this sense of desire, of longing for, some kind of acknowledgement, of some kind of union, again, surrounded by all of these flowers. So again, this kind of sense of blurring this line between erotic and spiritual desire. Then here, this kind of even older child, in which here now the Christ figure, actually does start to come down and comfort him. I mean, it's kind of a very touching image here. Then an image like this staring at the Sacred Heart. Once again, this folk imagery, the folk imagery of the Sacred Heart is something that's very common. It's an object of desire, once again. There's this sense of the two coming together, of physical and spiritual desire. And then there's other kind of interesting things, this kind of little soap container down here, this notion of purification and purity. And then again, this figure in the bed, sort of manger-like bed, that sort of sense of identification again. So basically what seems to be happening in a lot of his work is, again, this notion of a kind of identification of the physical and the spiritual realm, of the inability, in a sense, to separate those two. Now, so far I've been showing male artists, and I want to turn now to female artists. And before doing that, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that in Catholicism, female spirituality plays out differently than male spirituality. It's a cliche, of course, to talk about the misogyny of the Catholic Church, and there's certainly an element there. Serrano did it in that image that we looked at, and it's unmistakable, so it's clearly there. But there's also something else going on in Catholicism, and if you think to the fact that Catholicism is the one that has the very powerful female figures. It has the figure of Mary, who in fact is so important, that without her, the whole redemption saga wouldn't happen. She's it ends up being the absolutely crucial key figure. And then you've got Mary Magdalene, as I was mentioning. You have Saint Teresa. You have any number of saints. And so there's a very strong kind of female presence, and in a sense that in fact women, okay, there's the misogyny, but women are also absolutely key and absolutely important. And I think the reason for this can be better understood if we think about the way in which body and soul kind of were dealt with in medieval theology. And I'm indebted now to what I'm going to be talking about to Carolyn Walker Bynum, who is a medievalist who's done a lot of very interesting stuff about the female body in kind of medieval theology and medieval Catholicism. And one of the things that she talks about is that in the Middle Ages, there was a tendency there was this split, of course, between the body and the soul, and that men tended to be identified with soul or the mind, the mental, the spiritual kind of, and women tended to be identified with the body. Because of the status of the body in medieval Catholicism, the female body, because the woman is identified with the body, and specifically the body of Christ. The male is sort of identified with the soul and the spirit of Christ, woman identified with the body of Christ. Because of that, she actually has a very important role, because of course the body is, as we were saying, the vessel through which the whole story happens. So it's absolutely key. So it gives her a certain kind of status to be identified with the body. Bynum, in fact, relates this to the fact that the majority of mystics tended to be female, because there was this kind of whole issue of this identification with and union with Christ, the sort of physical / spiritual union with Christ that was, this notion of a mystical marriage of the two souls that seemed to be very much about a kind of, female way of relating to the realm, the divine realm. She also points out that there are a number of images of female Christs. A lot of the borders that we see as very sacrosanct were very fluid at that time. And so there was sort of the notion of Christ as a female related to the idea of the redemptive blood of Christ was seen as being very similar to the kind of the sustaining milk that comes from the Virgin Mary. And there was a kind of blood milk thing that went on. I mean, it's a very interesting arguments here. I won't go into them in great depth. But basically why I find this important is that what it does is it sets up a situation where the body becomes the means of a kind of spiritual knowledge. It's a different kind of knowledge than the mind offers, but is nevertheless just as important. And that idea, the notion of the body as a means of knowledge, I think meshes very well with contemporary feminist concerns, and is something that gets to be picked up by a number of the women artists from Catholic backgrounds, who are thinking about these kinds of issues. And I want to begin now with Kiki Smith, for whom I think this is very much an important issue. She admits that she has a fascination with the figure of Mary as what she calls a female goddess figure. She doesn't worry so much about the nuances of theology, but for her the power of that image is very important. And she's also very fascinated with the notion of flesh. And a lot of her work is about kind of the beauty of flesh. And again, it's playing in a way with our revulsion about things physical. So she'll do things that sort of focus on blood, or that appear to be kind of body muscle or viscera, that have this kind of very graphic feeling, and that are definitely beautiful, but also kind of creepy from our sort of standpoint of our sort of distrust of the body. But in her case, in a sense, it goes back to kind of this very Catholic notion of flesh as a carrier of soul. This is a piece called Virgin Mary. And what it depicts is it's a female figure here, and she's been flayed, meaning her skin has been removed so that you see the veins and the muscles underneath. For Smith, essentially, the Virgin Mary gave herself to God. She was a lifelong virgin because of her kind of service to God. And so, in a sense, her flesh, her outer layer is removed because it becomes part of this sort of sacrifice in a way. And in that sense, of course, she becomes a Christ-like figure. And in fact, the way that she's standing here has a rather Christ-like quality. This is called Virgin. It's actually a piece made of paper. It emphasizes kind of this milk-white purity. Again, this notion of white and milk. But one of the things that's, of course, arresting about this image is that you see here, although she seems to be clothed, in fact, her sexual organs here are exposed. And so this notion, again, of the physicality, there's this sort of sexual quality, even in the midst of this kind of very, very purified image. Now that contrasts with this image, and this one is called Mary Magdalene, and is a definite homage, deliberate homage to the Donatello that I showed earlier on. And so on the one hand, and this is in a way that's the dichotomy within Catholicism of the female figures. On the one hand, the purity, the pure spiritual virginal mother, and then kind of the animal sexuality, which is suspect, but also in a certain way necessary, and part of the seduction process that goes on to seduce the soul into its communion with Christ. So here we have both a very sexual image, but also it's very voluptuous, and again, emphasizing the sort of the carnality or the animal-like quality of that sort of sexuality. So playing with the way that in Catholicism there's this oscillation between these two aspects. And then finally this image, which is a kind of Madonna-like image, again a paperwork, and going back to our fluid discussion here, the hair becomes the tendrils of milk coming from the breasts that sort of rain down here, these sort of streaming onto the floor. Another artist I'd like to talk about is Janine Antoni. She creates objects, but part of what they're really about is the process and a certain kind of performative act that preceded them. In all of her works, there's some kind of sort of sense of it's a performance, but also often a kind of, the performances often have to do with some sort of element of endurance. And this goes back to that sort of notion of the mortification of the body. This is an image called Butterfly Kisses, and it's got kind of these little delicate black kind of flecks on this white field. But what's important about it is the way that it was made, it was made by, she loaded up her eyelashes with mascara and she beat them against the paper. And, just the thought of that is kind of very painful. And that's part of the point, in fact. Very often in her work, there's this element of kind of endurance, of undergoing some kind of a process which then leads to a certain purification. And I think that's even clearer. She did a whole series of works that were involving lard and chocolate. And this one is called Lick and Lather. And it consists of two sets of busts. One set of the busts are made out of lard, white lard. The other set made out of chocolate. They're sort of set up, kind of facing each other. In both cases, she has licked them down. So she has sort of eroded them, or we might argue purified them in a certain way by licking them. In the lard one that you just saw, the face of the figure is almost totally gone. Here it's generalized, it's beginning to sort of melt away, but still recognizable. And you can see also sort of the way that the chocolate is sort of turning as a result of that applied moisture. Now there's a number of interesting things going on here. First of all, of course, I think it's significant, the white and the chocolate color. So you've got that kind of black-white, earthy and spiritual kind of dichotomy going on again. Then you also have the element of physical endurance and pain, because one of the things that she talks about in doing these works with lard and chocolate is when you lick or you chew lard or chocolate for a long period of time, which she did, you end up breaking out with canker sores. I mean, it's really a painful kind of operation. So again, in order to create this artwork, in order to create something that's more purified, you end up having to go through this sort of process of sort of self-endurance of pain, not really flagellation and mutilation, but still, look, close to that in a sense. Unlike the other artists I'm talking about, her work is about, it sort of relates more to the notion of theater and performance, but is something which relates her, I think, to an earlier body of Catholic work by artists in the 70s doing performance, sort of endurance art in the 70s, who, it turns out, also came from Catholic backgrounds. The final artist that I want to talk about is a French artist named Michel Blondel. She's, being French, seems, again, somewhat less conflicted about her Catholicism, and it comes through in her work. In France, maybe there's less of a sense of conflict about it than there is being a Catholic in a country like the United States, where you are kind of butting up a lot against a dominant kind of religion or religious sensibility, which is quite different than your own. And Blondel's work, of course, is also about the notions of eroticism, desire, sexuality, the physical body, and a lot of it takes off from her experience as a young girl and her kind of awakening to the sense of sexuality, as she says, looking at that half-naked man on a cross in church. She has a very playful quality in her work, and in a sense it continues to be informed by that child's sort of curiosity about that figure on the cross and his surrogate, the priest. And I know, having grown up Catholic, there's always a speculation about, well, what does the priest look like underneath that cassock? What's really going on there? And it's a powerful thing for a young girl, and it's true that your kind of your first introduction to a naked male body is that crucifix. At any rate, so she's done a number of works that sort of really play with this sort of thing. This one I think is particularly amusing. It's called Immaculate Conception. So this is like this sort of glass form here, and it's got this sort of nipple thing on it, and it's pointing here at this. There's a chair, and then this is a little bottle of white soap. Now, what you're supposed to do, there is a performative aspect here, is you're supposed to squirt the white soap and see if try to get it to hit that form. This thing is sort of very breast-like, obviously, and then that fluid, okay, it's milk-like, it's also semen-like. I mean, there's obviously kind of a little sexual thing going on. And then the title, of course, Immaculate Conception, referring to the fact that the Virgin Mary, supposedly conceived without sin. The piece seems to be questioning that particular piece of Catholic orthodoxy. This is a piece called God is Love. And these are actual vestments. And again, this is something, in France, she can actually write away to priests and get them to donate or loan her these beautiful vestments for an artwork. She's even done these done installations in churches, something that'd be kind of hard to imagine in this country. So here we've got the vestment, and then we've got these, obviously phallic forms here. One of the things that's also going on here, though, interestingly, is that the two ball forms, on the one hand, they could be male genitalia, but there's also kind of, they're very breast-like. In a lot of her work, there's a kind of, sort of gender flipping thing that's going on as well. Again, that female fantasy, what's going on under that vestment. This is a piece called Widow's Veil. This is obviously a church, the plan, a plan of a church. But she's noticed, as others have also, but maybe not commented on quite so blatantly, certainly has a phallic quality. And in the center of it is this little glass thing that's very vaginal. And so, one of the things that seems to be going on here is sort of relocating sexuality and the body back into the very heart of of Catholicism here, the church itself. This is from a whole series called My Little Confession, and there are a bunch of these. And again, if you're raised Catholic, you recognize the confessional here. And again, you get this very phallic, sexual kind of imagery, but created here out of a religious figurine, and again, two of these sort of ambiguously male-female forms. So again, kind of what's really being confessed, or what's the real secret here. This is an installation, and it's called Well Hung. And her titles are really great. And okay, what it consists of, is that these actual church vestments, and they're hanging here in kind of a cross shape, and underneath them is a mirror and more of these little glass phallic things going on. And what this is about is the fact that when there's a new pope, whenever a new pope is ordained, and someone has the job of checking under his vestments to confirm that he actually is a man. And this is because apparently it turned out once, back in the medieval era, that a woman slipped through, and they don't want that to happen again. So here we have, this sort of playful thing with the mirror. Then we get to look up underneath. It also, of course, brings to mind all those sort of jokes about the patent leather shoes and all of that stuff. What is hidden, comes to the fore again, and again, the hidden sexuality of Catholicism once again is revealed. For a long time, I think we've had this sense that religion and modernism kind of went their separate ways, and that anyone who was an artist worth his or her salt, put that religious background behind it as a superstition and kind of moved on. In a sense, I guess modernism became its own religion. But in fact, in sort of excising religion from any discussion of art or discussion of what an artist is about, we end up really impoverishing it. And what we forget the fact that for most of the period of Western art, religion is one of the most potent sources of influence and inspiration. And by denying that, the religious influences, I think, didn't really go away. They just sort of went underground and got sublimated and came up in kind of different ways. More recently, it seems that artists are feeling more comfortable about owning up to the fact that their work has something to do with their religious upbringing, with their religious identity. And I've noticed, even just in the last 5 years, a kind of a really significant change in that direction. And I think it's very important, because it's an aspect that's really been suppressed from our discussions of art. And if you begin to start bringing that element in, suddenly you have a sort of a whole different read on a lot of things that are going on in art, and particularly with these artists. And also, I think, you begin to get a different read on the culture war, which is the second reason why I think it's important to talk about this. Because I do think that one of the reasons that these particular, that Catholic artists always tend to be the ones who get hammered is because, they're caught in this battle over morality that's going on in our country. And somehow we've allowed the Christian fundamentalists to define what morality is. They can say family values, this is a Christian country, and we've sort of let them do that. But in letting them do that, and letting them claim the moral authority, we're letting them claim that religion and morality then are based on their view of this rigid opposition between good and evil, between the body and the soul, and between the sacred and the profane. And one of the consequences of this is that they tend to promote this utopian vision of society in which we're striving for perfection. Again, this notion the body is bad, which basically runs counter to human nature, and as a result labels many human behaviors deviant. And so I think it's actually a very dangerous tendency. And one of the things I think it's important to start talking about, this other kind of view of religion, is that it reminds us that there's another kind of spirituality, and it is a spirituality which accepts imperfection and irrationality, and it accepts the dark side of human experience. And artists like these, whether they are or are not practicing their religion, I think are reintroducing the possibility for a different way of thinking about religion and morality, which I think would greatly enrich our national dialogue. So that's another reason that I think that it's extremely important. Thank you very much.